It is exactly 10:14 a.m. in Sydney, and while the world outside is celebrating a royal tour, inside Suite 1502 of the Intercontinental Hotel, something quiet but explosive is about to reshape the Sussex legacy forever. As of this morning, Monday, May 4, 2026, new documents have surfaced from the core of what insiders call the Sussex Survivors Club, and what they reveal goes far beyond a simple disagreement. It unfolds like a calculated lesson in psychological warfare. Picture the moment clearly. Prince Harry stands on the balcony, looking out at the crowd below, while his chief of staff, Sarah Fosmo, a professional shaped by years at the Gates Foundation and not easily shaken, reaches out with a simple routine gesture, lightly tapping his shoulder to point out a group waiting for him. But in that split second, everything changes, and the atmosphere turns ice cold. Witnesses say Meghan Markle didn't speak a single word. Instead, she delivered what insiders now describe as a death stare, a look so sharp and intense that experts in criminal psychology would define it as a display of possessive control, leaving everyone in the room frozen. One staff member later described it as if the air had completely disappeared from the suite, with Meghan's eyes locked precisely on the spot where Sarah's hand touched Harry's suit, silently marking a boundary that needed no explanation. No one touches the asset without permission. If that moment feels intense, what follows only deepens the picture, because this isn't just rumor or speculation. It is backed by documented records tied directly to Kensington Palace personnel files. What was once dismissed as quiet whispers has now taken shape as something far more concrete, as the Sussex Survivors Club emerges not as gossip, but as a recorded reality. At the center of this is an internal email sent by Jason Knopf to Simon Case, written in a tone that insiders describe as deeply alarming, where he clearly stated his concern that the Duchess had managed to push 2 personal assistants out of the household within a single year, calling the treatment of staff completely unacceptable. He went even further, explaining that Meghan often seemed to focus on one individual at a time, gradually wearing down their confidence in a calculated and systematic way until they eventually broke under pressure. According to former courtiers, this wasn't random behavior but part of a consistent pattern, almost like an unwritten system operating behind the scenes, one that followed a predictable structure. It would begin with the public image, the warm, compassionate figure, the advocate for kindness and empathy. But the moment the cameras were gone, that image would reportedly shift into something far more controlling. One former aide shared a late-night experience that still unsettles them, recalling how Meghan allegedly shouted, "Get me something that works, you idiots," after a branding idea failed to gain traction, and when the aide tried to calmly explain the practical limitations, the response wasn't discussion but sharp, deliberate belittlement that left them in tears, reinforcing a workplace environment where pressure wasn't just expected, it was weaponized. By the time we reach May 4, 2026, the consequences of this pattern have reached a breaking point, and the voices coming forward are no longer just frustrated former employees. They are individuals who claim to have experienced serious emotional and psychological strain. Some reports suggest that a number of these former staff members sought professional psychiatric help, with a few even entering rehabilitation programs in an attempt to recover from what they describe as a deeply toxic work environment. What is now coming into focus is not a single isolated incident from Sydney, but what appears to be a long-term management approach, one that documents suggest may have crossed the boundaries defined by workplace bullying standards within royal households. As analysts go through these records, a troubling contradiction begins to emerge. How can someone speak so powerfully and publicly about mental health awareness on the global stage, while at the same time being accused of creating conditions that allegedly pushed their own staff toward emotional collapse? This growing tension between public image and private conduct is becoming harder to ignore, raising questions about whether the persona presented to the world has been carefully constructed to mask a very different reality behind closed doors. Even now, in 2026, as Meghan shares vague and symbolic messages inspired by a Las Vegas-based astrologer suggesting that her hardest 7 years have finally come to an end, those who claim to have suffered during that same period are starting to push back, asking a pointed question. If those years were so difficult for someone living with immense wealth, major media contracts, and luxury on every level, then what did those same years feel like for the people who say they were left behind, broken in the process? Stay with us, because in the next phase of this story, the focus shifts from personal accounts to something even more concrete, the money, and what it reveals about what's really happening behind the gates of Montecito. We are about to step inside the mansion itself to understand why some of California's elite have quietly started referring to the Sussexes as the poorest rich people in the room, and why financial analysts believe the clock is steadily counting down. There are serious questions surrounding a reported $7 million renovation that, according to insiders, never actually happened, and that detail alone begins to hint at a much larger issue beneath the surface. To fully understand the situation as it stands on May 4, 2026, we have to go back and carefully break down the 7-year timeline that Meghan Markle herself recently described as the hardest period of her life. From the outside, it looked like a dream: global recognition, massive deals, and opportunities that most people could never imagine. But behind the private walls of Montecito, that same period is now being reframed as a slow countdown toward something far less glamorous. The story doesn't begin in California though. It starts back in May 2019 at Frogmore Cottage, a moment when public perception first began to shift. Around £2.4 million of taxpayer money was poured into renovations, and while the figure alone sparked backlash, it wasn't just about the cost, it was about what it represented: the beginning of a pattern where expectations of royal privilege clashed with resistance to royal accountability, setting the tone for everything that followed. Fast forward to January 2020, and the situation reaches a decisive turning point at the Sandringham Summit, a moment that effectively changed the entire direction of the Sussex story. This is where the financial connection to the royal family was formally cut, and what many now refer to as Megxit moved from speculation into reality. It wasn't just a relocation to California, it was a high-stakes shift into complete independence, with King Charles, then the Prince of Wales, making it clear that private financial support would come to an end. From that moment on, Harry and Meghan were fully responsible for sustaining their own lifestyle, but the reality of that freedom quickly came with pressures that far exceeded expectations. By March 2021, the strategy had noticeably evolved, moving away from royal service and into something far more media-driven, where personal grievances became part of a global narrative. The interview with Oprah Winfrey marked a turning point, as it transformed private family tensions into a worldwide conversation and effectively introduced what many analysts later described as a victimhood brand, where personal pain itself became the central message. This shift brought attention, but it also established a new dependency on public narrative as a source of influence and income. Then came December 2022, when the Netflix deal was announced. Valued at around $100 million, it was presented as the ultimate financial foundation for their future. On paper, it looked like long-term security, but behind the numbers was a different reality: a lifestyle built around extremely high ongoing costs, from private security to a $14 million Montecito estate, all operating on a finite stream of income rather than unlimited wealth. This imbalance between spending and sustainability quietly marked the beginning of a financial strain that would only become more visible in the years ahead. By August 2024, the cracks in that carefully built public image were becoming harder to ignore, even for those who had supported the Sussex narrative from the beginning. The Columbia Tour, which was presented as a major international appearance, was quietly seen by many insiders as an attempt to recapture royal-level influence without the institutional backing that once came with it. There was pageantry, carefully managed appearances, and a visible effort to project global importance, but behind the scenes, the commercial impact was far less impressive than expected. No major new deals followed, no significant tech partnerships materialized, and the momentum that once surrounded their brand began to slow in a way that was difficult to reverse. Over time, what remained was a growing sense of Sussex fatigue among global audiences, where attention started to fade and curiosity was replaced with repetition. Then, in April 2026, a more symbolic moment arrived when Meghan Markle shared a cryptic post linked to a Las Vegas-based astrologer known as Spirit Daughter, suggesting that a difficult 7-year cycle had finally come to an end. For critics and analysts watching closely, this raised deeper questions, not about astrology itself, but about timing and messaging, especially when viewed against the backdrop of ongoing financial pressure and shifting public sentiment. It created a sharp contrast between the idea of emotional transformation and the very real discussions happening around contracts, expenses, and sustainability. And now, standing here on May 4, 2026, the central question becomes unavoidable. If those years were described as the hardest while generating hundreds of millions in deals, what does the next chapter look like when that level of financial inflow is no longer guaranteed? To understand why the public mood has shifted so sharply by this point in May 2026, it's important to look beyond the headlines and examine what experts describe as a structured PR victimhood loop. This isn't presented as a single event, but rather as a repeating cycle that transforms private conflict into public sympathy, and eventually into financial opportunity. However, as of now, that system appears to be under strain. It begins, according to analysts, with an internal trigger, some kind of friction behind closed doors, whether in royal environments or within private estates in California. These moments are then said to escalate into tense interactions that never fully enter the public record, but are later described by former staff as deeply uncomfortable or emotionally draining. From there, the next phase is information control, where legal agreements and strict confidentiality measures ensure that only one version of events is able to reach the outside world, effectively limiting counter-narratives. Once that silence is established, the narrative often shifts, and roles are inverted in public perception, with the focus moving away from internal accountability and toward external pressure or criticism, amplified through media appearances and selective storytelling. After that comes the commercialization phase, where personal experiences, especially difficult ones, are transformed into content, interviews, or published works that generate significant revenue while reinforcing the same central narrative. But by 2026, something appears to be changing. Public response is no longer as receptive as it once was, and polling trends suggest declining approval and growing skepticism toward the recurring storyline. This leads into what analysts call the final stage of the loop, where the cost of maintaining the narrative begins to outweigh the benefits, and audience trust starts to weaken. At that point, the cycle no longer functions as it once did, because the core requirement, public belief, begins to erode, and without it, the entire structure struggles to sustain itself. At this stage, attention turns to what is happening on the financial side, because behind all the public narratives, there is a parallel story being tracked by property analysts and private bankers who monitor high-net-worth estates in Montecito. The $14 million residence, often referred to as the shadow of Riven Rock, is, on the surface, presented as a symbol of success and stability, but internally it is increasingly being described as a long-term financial burden rather than an asset. In elite circles, there is an unspoken rule that properties of this level are not just purchased, they are continuously reinvested in, often requiring an additional $7 to $10 million in upgrades to meet the standards of that community. Yet according to multiple insider accounts, much of that expected transformation has not taken place. Instead, reports suggest that the home still reflects an older design aesthetic, with limited visible modernization, raising questions among observers about whether the level of available liquid capital is sufficient for the lifestyle being maintained. Financially, the situation becomes clearer when looking at the ongoing burn rate associated with maintaining a pseudo-royal lifestyle in California. With costs including round-the-clock private security, legal teams, staff, and estate upkeep, annual expenses are estimated in the multi-million-dollar range. For years, this structure was supported in part by inheritance funds linked to Princess Diana, but analysts now suggest that those reserves have been significantly reduced, shifting the couple from living off investment growth to gradually consuming the principal itself. In financial terms, this marks a critical transition, because it means wealth is no longer self-sustaining, it is being actively depleted. Within this context, some observers describe the situation not as traditional affluence, but as a form of high-cost dependency, where lifestyle commitments exceed long-term earning stability. It is within this framework that forecasts begin to appear, suggesting potential financial pressure points in the coming years if new income streams do not match outgoing expenses. As the financial picture becomes more closely examined, attention shifts to long-term projections that analysts have begun quietly discussing in private reports. According to these estimates, the current trajectory of spending versus income places the Sussex financial structure under increasing strain, particularly when factoring in fixed obligations such as security, staffing, legal retainers, and estate maintenance. In this context, some financial observers argue that the situation is no longer about luxury, but about sustainability, where even high-value assets can become liabilities if cash flow does not keep pace with expenditure. The concern being raised is not immediate collapse, but gradual erosion, where reserves are slowly reduced over time to maintain a lifestyle that requires constant funding. Within these projections, some forecasts suggest that if no significant new commercial agreements or long-term revenue sources are secured, the pressure on liquidity could intensify over the coming years, creating a narrowing financial window. At the same time, critics point out that the public-facing brand still relies heavily on high-cost visibility, international travel, media production, and security-heavy appearances, which further increases operational burn rather than reducing it. This contrast between image and financial infrastructure is what analysts describe as the core tension of the Montecito model: high global presence paired with finite, contract-based funding. As a result, discussions in financial circles increasingly focus not on current wealth, but on sustainability timelines, where the key question is how long the existing structure can be maintained without major restructuring of income, spending, or public strategy. As we reach the final part of this timeline, the focus shifts from projections and patterns to what is unfolding in real time on the ground in Montecito and beyond. Recent developments suggest that internal pressures are becoming harder to contain, both financially and publicly, as the gap between lifestyle commitments and incoming opportunities continues to narrow. In elite real estate and banking circles, the conversation is no longer about growth or expansion, but about endurance. How long a high-cost structure can realistically be maintained when revenue streams are inconsistent and increasingly unpredictable. This has led to growing speculation around future strategic decisions, including whether major adjustments to spending, branding, or public engagement may eventually become unavoidable. At the same time, attention has returned to Prince Harry's public behavior and private positioning, with analysts suggesting that his visible detachment from traditional royal identity reflects a deeper uncertainty about long-term direction. On the other side, Meghan's increasingly symbolic messaging and emphasis on personal transformation narratives are being interpreted by some observers as an attempt to reframe public perception during a period of transition. Together, these parallel developments have created a sense of instability around what was once presented as a carefully controlled post-royal brand. As of May 4, 2026, the central question is no longer just about legacy or reputation, but about sustainability. Whether the structure built over the past 7 years can adapt to changing financial realities and shifting public attention, or whether it will eventually be forced into a fundamental reset in order to survive.